She doesn't need to look at the menu. Elaine Bennett smiled at the waiter. Just give her the simplest dish. I looked up. My son stayed silent. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. In that moment, I understood a bitter truth. I wasn't invited here as a mother. I was invited as a problem to be handled. I nodded, smiled, and said nothing. They had no idea that the woman wearing this old dress had signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. And they knew even less. Tonight, I didn't come here to eat dinner. I came to see who they really were. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. The restaurant sat on the top floor of a historic hotel in downtown Boston, where the red brick exterior stood in stark contrast to the luxurious interior. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linen. The silverware arranged with such precision it felt almost impersonal. Through the large glass windows behind our table, I could see the Charles River shimmering at night, the lights reflecting on the water like memories that refused to fade. This was the first time I was meeting Claire's parents, my daughter-in-law's parents, and also the first time in many years that I felt this out of place. I sat upright in the soft leather chair, my hands resting lightly on my lap. My old, worn fabric bag hung neatly on the back of the chair. The dress I was wearing was ash gray, simple in style, one I had owned for many years. It wasn't ugly, but it clearly didn't belong here. I knew that the moment I walked in and felt the glances sweep over me, quick, cold, and full of judgment. Andrew, my son, sat to my right. He was 36 now, a grown man with a steady job, broad shoulders, straight posture. But at that moment, he was staring down into his water glass as if it held the answer to all his troubles. I recognized that habit from when he was a child. When Andrew went quiet like that, it meant he was avoiding something. Claire sat to Andrew's left wearing a navy blue dress that fit her perfectly, elegant without being flashy. She was beautiful in the way fashion magazines love, bright face, softly curled brown hair, just enough makeup. But since we sat down, Claire had barely looked at me for more than a second. Every time our eyes met, she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her napkin, check her phone, or gaze out the window. Across from me sat Elaine Bennett. She was in her early 60s, her light blonde hair carefully styled, not a strand out of place. The jewelry she wore wasn't large, but one glance was enough for me to know it was far from inexpensive. Every movement Elaine made carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, favored, and taken seriously. Beside her was Thomas Bennett, her husband, a man with a deep voice and the demeanor of someone used to making decisions. He didn't speak much, but every sentence was short and firm, as if no one would think to challenge him. Elaine's comment to the waiter came the moment we lifted our menus. Her tone was gentle, almost caring, but I had lived long enough to know that some words don't need to be loud to wound deeply. Just give her the simplest dish. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't look at me to confirm. She didn't treat me as someone with the right to choose. I looked up instinctively, my gaze passing over everyone at the table. Andrew remained silent. Claire lightly bit her lower lip. Elaine smiled, satisfied. Thomas took a sip of water, not participating, but not stopping it either. And in that moment, something became crystal clear in my mind, sharp as a freshly cleaned mirror. I wasn't invited here as Andrew's mother. I was invited here to be evaluated. I felt a faint heat rise up my neck, but I took a deep breath and steadied my breathing. I had learned this a long time ago. in boardrooms, intense negotiations, in situations where a single emotional misstep could cost you everything. I nodded to the waiter and smiled politely. Yes, that's fine. Elaine's smile widened just a little, as if she had done something right. The waiter folded the menus, bowed slightly, and walked away. I knew that if at that moment I had said, "No, I'd like to see the menu," or "I can choose for myself," the atmosphere at the table would have shifted instantly. But I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I was curious. I wanted to see how far they would go if I let everything unfold the way they wanted it to. I began to observe. Thomas talked about their recent trip to Napa Valley, his voice even but unmistakably proud. Elaine followed, describing a charity fundraiser where she met very valuable connections. Claire nodded along with her mother's story, occasionally adding small details as if to prove she belonged in that world too. Andrew only spoke when directly addressed, and his answers were shorter than usual. I looked at my son, and a heavy feeling rose in my chest. Not anger, but disappointment. Not disappointment that Andrew didn't defend me, but because I realized he was ashamed. No one said it out loud, but I could see it clearly in the way Andrew avoided my eyes, in how he adjusted his collar whenever Elaine glanced at me, in the tension visible in his hands clasped together under the table. I suddenly understood that, in the Bennett family's eyes, I wasn't just Andrew's mother. I was a variable that didn't fit the picture they had painted for their son's life. A simple mother, a past that needed to be softened, a detail that should be controlled. The thought made my chest ache, but I didn't show it. I was used to being judged by appearances. I was used to being placed into neat little boxes that made other people comfortable. It was just that. It had been a very long time since I had been sitting on this side of the table. I looked at the glass in front of me, the light reflecting off its clear surface, distorting my own image. The woman in the old dress looked calm, almost harmless. If they knew that this woman had once led meetings where hundreds of people sat in silence waiting for her to speak, if they knew that she had signed contracts capable of changing the lives of thousands of people, if they knew... I quietly clenched my hands. No, tonight was not the time for them to know. Tonight, I wanted to see every layer of their masks. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer them. And when the appetizer arrived, a small, simple portion placed in front of me while elaborate, artfully presented plates were set before everyone else, I knew my decision to stay silent had been the right one. This wouldn't be just a dinner. This was when I began to remember every look, every word, every polite but cold smile. Because sometimes the only way to truly understand a person is to let them believe you are nothing at all. When the appetizer was set in front of me, I kept the same polite smile. But inside, a different stream of thought was quietly unfolding. Not for them, but for those listening to this story. Perhaps it was time I said something that, for many years, only I and very few people in my professional circle had known. I am not the woman Andrew, my son, thinks I am. For more than 20 years, I have held a senior executive position at a multinational corporation, headquartered in the United States, operating across major markets in North America and Europe. My work isn't glamorous in the way that makes headlines, but every decision I sign involves millions of dollars, sometimes the livelihoods of entire chains of people I've never met. I am used to closed-door meetings, negotiations that stretch late into the night, and the pressure of always having to be sharp and precise. My income, to be blunt, is far higher than anyone would imagine looking at the old dress I'm wearing tonight. Each month, the number alone would make many people pause. Beyond my salary, I hold company shares, long-term investments in retirement funds, commercial real estate, and several early-stage projects I joined when few believed they would succeed. My bank account has never been something I worry about, even during the most difficult economic periods. But Andrew doesn't know any of that. My son grew up believing his mother was just a long-time administrative employee at an ordinary company, a woman who went to work regularly, came home on time, lived in a small apartment, and never talked about money. And that wasn't because I lied. I simply didn't say more. I've lived in the same 2-bedroom apartment for nearly 20 years. It's in a quiet neighborhood, not upscale, but clean and safe. The old elevator creaks every time it goes up or down. The hallway is narrow, the yellow lights slightly dim. There's no large balcony, no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. But there's enough morning light, a compact kitchen, and a living room big enough for an old sofa and a bookshelf filled with books I've read many times. I could have moved long ago. In fact, real estate agents have called me more times than I can count, pitching Riverview penthouses and townhouses in expensive neighborhoods where the annual property tax alone could support another family comfortably. But every time I declined. Not because I'm stingy, but because I don't see the need. I grew up poor, not the romantic kind of poverty you see in inspirational stories, but the kind that forces you to count every dollar, every meal. I lived in cramped rentals, wore old shoes to school, watched my mother work herself to exhaustion just to make sure I didn't have to drop out. Those years taught me something very early. Money can bring security, but showing it off rarely brings peace. When I first began making real money, I was tempted. I won't deny that. I stood in luxury stores, considered buying a car far more expensive than I needed, imagined living in a space that would make others admire me. But each time I asked myself, am I buying this because I need it or because I want to prove something? The answer wasn't always comfortable. And then I realized that the greatest freedom money gives me isn't the ability to buy anything I want, but the ability not to buy what I don't need. I deliberately kept Andrew away from those privileges, not because I didn't love him, but because I loved him too much. I didn't want him to grow up feeling like his path had already been paved. I wanted him to understand the value of work, effort, and taking responsibility for his own life. Andrew went to school on scholarships. He worked part-time during college. He complained about boring jobs, difficult bosses, mornings he had to wake up early even when he didn't want to. I listened, but I didn't intervene. I didn't call anyone to help him. I didn't use my connections to open doors in advance. I raised my son with discipline and consistency. Andrew knew there were things he had to do himself, consequences he had to face on his own. I didn't cushion him with money, and I didn't turn myself into a lifeline every time things got hard. I was always there, but behind him, not in front of him. Perhaps that's why Andrew always thought of me as just an ordinary woman, a kind but somewhat strict mother, living so simply that it sometimes made him feel embarrassed. And I let him think that. I never tried to correct that impression, not because I feared the truth, but because I feared the consequences of telling it. I was afraid that if Andrew knew who I truly was in the outside world, our relationship would change. I feared he would look at me differently, not as his mother, but as a mother with money. I feared his decisions might be influenced even slightly by the existence of an invisible safety net. And until recently, my life was peaceful that way. I went to work, came home, read books, took walks on weekend mornings. Andrew visited when he could. We ate dinner together in my small kitchen. No talk of money, no unspoken comparisons, no tension. Everything began to change when Andrew got married. The Bennett family entered my life very clearly. They were nothing like me. They were used to displaying their status, to social relationships built on financial foundations, to measuring people by what they owned. From the first stories Andrew told me about them, I sensed the difference. And tonight's dinner was the first test, not just for them, but for me. I wanted to know how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer. I wanted to know, without money standing between us, what a person's value looked like in their eyes. The Bennett family entered my life as a test I never sought, but never intended to avoid. And as I sat there, the simplest dish on the table placed in front of me, I understood that the peace I once had was likely over. But sometimes, peace has to be broken, so the truth can finally step into the light. Andrew's call came on a late afternoon, just as I set the kettle down on the stove and leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the small street below. Boston's sky that day was a pale gray, not raining but not sunny either, the kind of in-between weather the city is known for during the changing seasons. I remember thinking, before answering, that it would probably be another short call, asking about my health, reminding me to dress warmly or saying he'd be busy that weekend. Andrew's voice came through the line with a slight hesitation, subtle enough that most people might miss it, but I didn't. "Mom, I want to tell you something." I leaned back against the wall, holding the phone close to my ear. "Okay, go ahead." "Claire's parents, they're in Boston this week, and they want to meet you." I stayed silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because I had always known this moment would come. Andrew had been married for almost a year, and the two families meeting was only a matter of time. But the way he said it, almost as if he were asking for permission, as if he were testing my reaction, caught my attention. "Where do they want to meet?" I asked calmly. Andrew took a light breath, then said the name of the restaurant. It was a name I knew very well, not because I had eaten there, but because, in the business world, it was often mentioned as a symbol of status. One of the most expensive restaurants in Boston, a place people didn't go just to eat, but to be seen and to be recognized. I looked out the window again, street lights beginning to turn on one by one. "That restaurant?" I said, giving nothing away. "That's fine." Andrew seemed relieved that I agreed so quickly. He went on about the time, about how Claire had made the reservation, about how it would be an intimate dinner. I listened, nodding out of habit, until a thought surfaced in my mind. Quiet but impossible to ignore. "Andrew," I said, interrupting him, "what do Claire's parents know about me?" There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line. So brief that, if I hadn't known Andrew so well, I might not have noticed it. But I know every breath my son takes. "Well, I just told them you live simply," Andrew replied. "You know, you've always lived that way." The word simply was spoken lightly, as if it were obvious, as if it were a harmless description, but it landed on me heavier than Andrew realized. Simply. Not works at a corporation, not raised her son on her own, not is a strong woman, just simply. In that moment, something tightened in my chest. Not anger, but sadness. A quiet, familiar sadness, like realizing you've been neatly placed into a corner, not because you belong there, but because someone else thinks that's where you fit best. I didn't say anything right away. I let Andrew keep explaining that Claire's parents were fairly traditional, that they cared about appearances, that they just wanted a pleasant dinner. Andrew didn't say it outright, but I could hear a very clear hope in his words. He hoped I wouldn't make things complicated. And I understood. I understood that, on some level, my son was embarrassed by me. Not embarrassed because I was a bad person, but embarrassed because I didn't fit into the new world he was stepping into. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It came slowly, like rereading an old letter, and suddenly understanding the lines between the lines. I remembered the times Andrew suggested I buy newer clothes before attending events, the times he gently reminded me not to talk too much about my everyday life in front of his friends. Small details I had once brushed off, now rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. I didn't blame Andrew. If there is one thing I've learned in this life, it's this. Children don't mean to hurt their parents. They are only trying to find their place in the world, and sometimes in that process, they unconsciously push the people they love aside. Okay, I said finally, my voice still gentle. I understand. Andrew exhaled, clearly relieved. He added a few words about hoping I'd arrive on time, then said goodbye and hung up. I stood there for a long time after the phone screen went dark. My apartment was so quiet I could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. I looked around the room, the old but clean sofa, the dark wooden bookshelf, the small dining table just big enough for two. Everything here was familiar, marked by a life that wasn't flashy, but never lacking either. I walked slowly into the bedroom and opened my closet. On one side were the clothes I wore every day, simple, durable, easy to wash. Toward the back, carefully hidden, were the clothes I wore for work. Tailored suits, silk blouses, good leather shoes, two worlds coexisting in the same space, rarely touching. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, and for the first time since Andrew called, I allowed myself to think more deeply about the question that had just been asked. What did they know about me? The answer was simple. They only knew what Andrew wanted them to know. And that led me to another thought, one that made me furrow my brow, then let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. If they think I'm a simple woman, then I'll be a simple woman. Not because I want to deceive anyone, but because I want to see the truth. I want to know how they will treat me when they believe I have no money, no power, no connections that benefit them. I want to know, behind the polite smiles and flowery words, where a person's true value really lies in their eyes. At first, that thought made me feel a little cruel. But then I remembered how it felt to hear the word simple used almost as an apology on my behalf. I remembered Andrew's averted gaze, and I understood that sometimes, to protect yourself, you have to allow the truth to reveal itself instead of rushing to shield it. I stood up and closed the closet door. In the mirror, I saw an older woman, her face lined with wrinkles, her expression calm. No one could guess what she had lived through or what she held in her hands, and perhaps that was my greatest advantage. I decided I wouldn't explain anything more to Andrew. I wouldn't call back to clarify who I was or what I did. I would go to that dinner exactly as they had already imagined me, and let the truth reveal itself, not through words, but through how they treated me. That evening, after deciding to let the truth unfold in its own way, I did nothing more than tidy the kitchen, wash the half-finished teacup, and turn off some of the lights in the apartment. But that night, I didn't sleep deeply. Not because I was worried, but because my mind kept replaying very old images, moments I thought I had long forgotten. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, Pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, laying a soft yellow glow across the floor. The apartment was as quiet as ever, unchanged. But I knew that from this day on, something inside me was different. I opened the closet. In front were the clothes I wore every day. Neutral sweaters, simple trousers, dresses that never went out of style but never stood out either. Pushed neatly to the back was a small space where I kept things I rarely used. Hanging there was a gray dress, faded with time. That dress had been with me through many stages of my life. I bought it more than 10 years ago when I still had to think carefully about every expense. It wasn't ugly, just painfully ordinary. The fabric had softened from countless washes, the stitching at the hem no longer sharp. I had meant to give it away for years, but each time I hesitated and hung it back in its place. I pulled the dress out and laid it on the bed. Just looking at it, I knew this was exactly what I needed. I chose an old pair of shoes from the corner of the shoe rack. The soles were worn, the shine long gone. I bent down and brushed a thin layer of dust from the toes. They weren't torn or broken, but they clearly weren't something you'd wear to a fine restaurant. In the bathroom, I tied my hair neatly back, a simple style, nothing elaborate. I looked at the small makeup case on the shelf, the one I used for work, but then I closed it. No lipstick, no powder, no attempt to hide the wrinkles that had been there for years. I took my watch off my wrist and placed it in the drawer. No rings, no necklace, no earrings. My hands were bare, looking thinner without any adornment. I knew that in the world of people like the Bennett family, those small details could say a great deal. I took the old fabric bag hanging behind the door. The straps were frayed, the color uneven. I opened it and checked inside. Aside from my wallet, keys, and phone, I put in only one regular credit card, the kind I almost never used for work. It was enough for everyday expenses, nothing more. The black card was in a different wallet. I opened the nightstand drawer and took it out, looking at it for a long moment. The muted black surface reflected the dim light of the room. I didn't hesitate, but I didn't rush either. I slid it into the hidden inner pocket of the bag, where no one would see it unless I chose to take it out. Everything was ready. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom. The woman looking back at me was a version of myself I barely recognized. The gray dress revealed a figure no longer as straight as it once was. The worn shoes made my stance look heavier. My unmade face showed every wrinkle, every mark left by time. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I had never looked like this. On the contrary, I had been this woman for a very long stretch of my life. But it had been many years since I had consciously chosen to become her again. A strange feeling rose in my chest, as if I were deliberately stripping away everything I had built, returning to an old, forgotten starting point. The feeling of having my value erased came quickly and vividly. I knew that the moment I stepped outside like this, many people would automatically look at me differently, with less respect, with less patience, with less willingness to listen. I placed my hand on the cold mirror and looked straight into my own eyes. Those eyes were still mine, not afraid, not uncertain. Only the outer layer had changed. How they judge me, I whispered softly, is their choice. That sentence wasn't meant to comfort me. It was a reminder. I can't control what others think, but I can control how I respond to it. I wasn't doing this to diminish myself. I was doing this to understand them better. When I put on my coat and stepped out of the apartment, the familiar hallway greeted me with the smell of old paint and the soft yellow light. Don, the morning doorman, nodded at me as he did every day. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawson," he said with a friendly smile. "Good morning, Dawn," I replied naturally. He didn't look at me any differently. No one here ever did. To them, I was still just the woman in apartment 403 who always greeted people politely and paid her rent on time. And in that moment, I suddenly realized real respect doesn't come from what I'm hiding in my bag, but from how I've lived all these years. But I also knew that once I stepped into the world of the Bennett family, that wouldn't be true anymore. On the way to the restaurant, I chose to take a taxi instead of driving, not because I needed to, but because I wanted everything to stay consistent with the role I had chosen. The driver didn't ask many questions. He turned on the radio, an old song playing softly. I looked out the window as the city passed by. Familiar buildings, busy people, each carrying their own story. I took a deep breath when the car stopped in front of the hotel where the restaurant was located. The entrance was paved with gleaming stone. The staff stood upright in tailored suits. I stepped out of the car, gripping the strap of my fabric bag tightly. In that moment, I felt like I was stepping onto a stage where I had already chosen my role. Not the role of the winner, not the role of the wealthy, but the role of the underestimated. And I was ready. Ready to be looked down on. Ready to be placed into convenient boxes. Ready to hear things they would never say if they knew who I really was. I walked inside, blending into the lights, the voices, the refined scent of the restaurant. Inside me, there was no anger, no bitterness, only a very clear awareness. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was trading away. And more importantly, I knew that when tonight was over, it wouldn't be only them who would be exposed. I would see myself as well, not through the lens of power or money, but through how I faced being seen as less and still kept my dignity. The moment I stepped through the glass doors of the restaurant, I felt the first gaze fall on me. It wasn't a direct stare, nor was it outright rude. It was the kind of glance that skimmed quickly, then lingered a beat too long, long enough to assess, long enough to categorize. The host, dressed in a neat black suit, smiled politely, but the smile was just slightly delayed, as if his mind were processing something that didn't quite fit. The old dress, the worn shoes, the faded fabric bag, in a space where everything else was polished and carefully curated. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" His voice was still courteous, but his eyes passed over me once more. "Yes," I replied calmly. "The Bennett family." There was a very subtle shift in his expression, not surprise, but adjustment. He nodded and gestured for me to follow. I walked slowly past tightly spaced tables, the soft clink of cutlery against plates, the low murmur of conversation flowing like an unbroken current. And then I saw Andrew. My son stood up the moment he saw me approaching. But the movement was incomplete. He rose, then hesitated, as if unsure what to do next. Andrew's eyes flicked quickly over me, from the dress to the shoes, then turned away almost immediately. In that instant, I saw the unease clearly on the face I had looked at for more than 30 years. Not unease at seeing his mother, but unease because his mother appeared exactly as he had described her to others. Claire stood beside Andrew. My daughter-in-law looked radiant in the way this place favored. Her dress was finely cut, understated but clearly tailored. Her hair was softly styled, her makeup just enough to highlight her youth. But when Claire's eyes met mine, the smile on her lips didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mom," Claire said, stepping forward to hug me very quickly, very lightly. That hug felt more like a formality than a gesture of affection. "Hello, dear," I replied, my voice as gentle as always. Elaine Bennett was the next person I noticed. She sat upright in her chair, both hands neatly placed on the table. As I came closer, Elaine lifted her head, her eyes traveling from the top of my hair down to the hem of my dress, then stopping at the fabric bag hanging from my arm. She didn't speak right away. She simply observed. Thomas Bennett stood up last. He shook my hand, brief and firm, but without any warmth. A polite handshake, nothing more. "Very nice to meet you," Thomas said. "Andrew has told us a few things about you." "I hope they were good things," I smiled. He smiled back but didn't answer directly. We sat down. My chair was placed slightly off-center, not at the head of the table. A small detail, but I noticed it. Elaine adjusted her napkin, then turned to me. "Was the trip here smooth?" she asked, her tone light, just concerned enough. "Quite smooth," I replied. "Boston traffic has been very heavy lately," she continued, "especially for people who aren't used to driving downtown." The comment wasn't exactly insulting, but it carried an assumption that I was easily overwhelmed by this city, by this pace of life. I simply nodded, offering no objection. Thomas signaled the waiter to bring wine. He began talking about a bottle of red that had just arrived, emphasizing the vintage, the vineyard, and how difficult it was to find on the market. Elaine nodded along, adding a few details about their recent trip to California, where they had happened to look at some coastal properties. "We're considering buying another one," Elaine said casually. "You never know, Andrew and Claire might need it someday." Andrew hesitated slightly. Claire smiled, but there was tension in it. I sat there, listening, not interrupting. I knew this style of conversation well. It wasn't meant to share. It was meant to establish position, to remind everyone at the table who had the ability to give and who should be aware of that. Elaine turned to me. "Where do you live again?" she asked. "On the west side of the city," I replied. "Oh," Elaine nodded. "That area is quite quiet, very suitable for people who value stability." Stability, another word chosen with care. "What kind of work do you do?" Thomas asked next, his tone neutral. "I work in an office," I said briefly, just as Andrew had painted the picture. "Ah," Elaine smiled. "Jobs like that are very respectable. Not everyone needs high-pressure positions. What matters is having a balanced life." That compliment landed softly, but I heard every word. It wasn't recognition. It was placement, as if she were setting me on a lower rung of a ladder, then nodding in satisfaction because I knew my place. The waiter brought the menus. Elaine glanced through hers quickly, then began ordering for the table. When it came to me, she turned to the waiter and smiled. "She'll have the simplest dish. She probably isn't used to menus like this." The sentence was delivered so gently that anyone who reacted would seem overly sensitive. But I saw Andrew clench his hand under the table. Claire lowered her head. My dish arrived first. A small portion, simply presented. No elaborate garnish, no complex sauce. Meanwhile, in front of the others were carefully arranged plates, rich aromas drifting upward. Thomas took a sip of wine and continued talking about a new project, about people he had recently met, about very promising connections. Elaine added a few remarks, emphasizing names and places that, if I wanted to, I could easily have commented on. But I didn't. I stayed silent. And I remembered. I remembered the way Elaine looked at me whenever money was mentioned. I remembered Thomas's eyes when power came up. I remembered Andrew's silence and Claire's hesitation. The atmosphere at the table grew heavier. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Conversations about money, success, and status flowed past me like a prolonged test. And I sat there in my old dress with the cheapest dish on the table, listening to every soft word lined with hidden thorns. I knew this was only the beginning. When the plates were nearly cleared, Elaine Bennett was the first to set her knife and fork down. The gesture was light and proper, but I recognized it as a signal. She turned to me, her face relaxing into a gentler smile than before, the kind people use when they're about to say something they believe is for your own good. "Margaret," Elaine began slowly, as if choosing her words with care, "I just want to say, we truly admire you." I looked up calmly. The word admire sounded pleasant, but I had long learned to distinguish between words and the intentions behind them. "Raising a child on your own is never easy," she continued, "especially under circumstances when not everyone has many resources." The way she hesitated before the word resources caught my attention. No one at the table reacted. Thomas sipped his wine. Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. Claire stared down at her napkin. "I've always told Thomas," Elaine went on, "that women like you deserve respect, strong, enduring. But because of that, we do worry." "Worry?" I asked softly. "Yes," Elaine nodded. "You know, age eventually comes for all of us. Health, medical expenses, unexpected things. When you're young, you can manage, but later on—" She let the sentence trail off, then glanced at Andrew. "Andrew is a good son, very responsible. We can see that clearly." Andrew flinched slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be pulled into the conversation this way. He sat up straighter, but tension showed in his eyes. "He always puts others first," Thomas added, his voice low and steady. "And that's exactly why we think some things should be arranged early." I said nothing. I rested my hand on the edge of the table and listened. "Andrew and Claire have their whole future ahead of them," Thomas continued, looking at his son seriously. "Careers, family, children. We want them to focus on building their lives without being distracted by unnecessary pressures." "Unnecessary pressures," I heard the phrase clearly. Elaine nodded, then turned back to me. "Margaret, you understand what we're saying, don't you?" I understood, very clearly. "We've discussed it," Elaine went on, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "And we thought that if we could offer you a bit of financial support, everyone would feel more at ease." Andrew turned to me. "Mom." "Andrew." Elaine placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice softening. "We're just talking." Claire remained silent. She didn't look at me, and she didn't look at her parents either. Her gaze rested on the edge of the table, where subtle patterns ran like a road with no turn. "You mean," I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We were thinking," Elaine said, "a monthly allowance. Nothing big, just enough to help you feel more comfortable, so you won't have to worry about future expenses." Thomas nodded. "Family support. No strings attached." No strings attached. I almost smiled at the choice of words. "Of course," Elaine added, as if suddenly remembering something. "We also think that, given the current situation, it might be better if you didn't visit too often. Andrew and Claire need their own space. Young couples, you understand." And that was when the unspoken condition became clear, bright under the table lights. Money in exchange for disappearance. No one said it outright, but it didn't need to be said. The intention hung between us, heavy and cold. I looked at Elaine. She still wore her smile, but there was careful calculation in her eyes. I looked at Thomas. He wasn't smiling, but his gaze was firm, as if this were a reasonable, Shenji generous offer. I realized then that, in their minds, I wasn't Andrew's mother. I was a variable, a risk factor to be managed early, not with understanding, but with money. Andrew began shifting in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't think—" he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Andrew," Thomas cut in, his tone firmer, "we're talking about long-term planning, about responsibility." I looked at my son. Conflict was written all over his face. On one side were his in-laws, helping him in his career and life. On the other side was me. And in between was Claire's silence. My daughter-in-law said nothing. She didn't object. She didn't agree. She was simply quiet. That silence, in its own way, weighed heavier than words. I turned back to Elaine. "You want me to keep my distance?" I asked lightly, as if confirming a small detail. Elaine tilted her head slightly. "Just more appropriate for everyone. Appropriate." I nodded slowly. "And that allowance. How much would it be?" Andrew looked at me in surprise. Perhaps he expected me to refuse immediately. Perhaps he thought I would react, but I didn't. Elaine seemed relieved that I didn't push back. "We're thinking a modest amount, but enough so you won't have to worry." Thomas added, reinforcing it. "We don't want you to feel abandoned. We just want things to be clear." Clear. In my mind, everything suddenly became very sharp. Not because I was angry, but because the final picture had come together. They didn't believe they were doing something wrong. In their value system, this was a civilized solution. They use money to buy peace of mind, to buy order, to buy distance. And they believed that I, in my old dress, with the cheapest dish on the table, would be grateful for it. I didn't answer right away. I lowered my gaze, picked up my glass of water, and took a small sip. The cool water slid down my throat, helping me keep my voice steady. "Your offer is very thoughtful," I said at last. Andrew looked at me, confused. Claire lifted her head for the first time since the dinner began. Elaine smiled, clearly thinking she was on the right path. "I need some time to think," I added. "Things like this shouldn't be decided in a hurry." "Of course," Elaine replied immediately, unable to hide her satisfaction. "We just wanted you to know that we're always ready to help." Help. I nodded and set the glass down. In that moment, I knew I had what I needed. Not an answer, but confirmation. I had seen the true nature of this offer. I had seen how far they were willing to go if they believed I was the weaker one. And I also knew that the best thing I could do now was to let them keep talking, to keep revealing themselves, to keep believing they were in control. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to hear more, until there was no doubt left about who they truly were. I placed my hand on the table, not to claim space, but to steady myself. Their words still hung between us, heavy like smoke after a small fire. Elaine sat upright. Thomas leaned slightly forward. Andrew watched me as if waiting for a verdict. And Claire was quiet in a way that told me she knew this dinner was about to turn in another direction. "I'll tell you a story," I said, my voice calm, not loud, not emphasized, not to argue and not to justify myself, just so you understand where I come from. No one interrupted. I looked down at my hands that had worked all their lives, faint calluses softened by time, but the memory of them never fading. "I grew up in an old rental building in the southern part of the state," I began. "My parents worked themselves to exhaustion, and there was never enough money. I learned very early that if I wanted to survive, I had to stand on my own. I paused briefly, long enough for old images to come back clearly. The small kitchen, the refrigerator that rattled at night, winter mornings when I went to school in a thin coat because there wasn't a thicker one. When Andrew was born, I continued, I was on my own. No family nearby, no support, no safety net, just a newborn baby and an hourly job. Andrew shifted slightly. I knew this part. He'd never heard all of it. I worked from early morning until late at night, I said, not looking directly at my son. 12 hours was normal, some days 14. I carried Andrew to the neighbor's house to ask them to watch him, then ran off to work. I came home when he was already asleep. The next morning, I left again before he woke up. Elaine pressed her lips together slightly. Thomas stopped leaning back in his chair. At night, I continued, when everything was quieter, I studied. I enrolled in evening classes. I borrowed books from the library. I studied in the kitchen under a dim light with a cheap cup of coffee beside me. I looked at Andrew then. You never knew any of that, did you? He shook his head very slightly. I didn't tell you, I said, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want you to grow up thinking things came easily. I wanted you to understand the value of doing things yourself, learning for yourself, standing back up when you fall. I turned back to Elaine and Thomas. I started at the very bottom of a corporation, secretary, then assistant, then junior manager. I had no one backing me, no connections. I had only one thing. I didn't quit. The atmosphere at the table changed noticeably. The clinking of cutlery from nearby tables suddenly felt distant, as if we were sitting in a closed room. I moved up step by step, I said evenly. Each step meant more responsibility, more hours, more difficult decisions. There were nights I came home at 2 a.m., and the next morning I still woke up early to take Andrew to school. I paused and took a deep breath. There were sacrifices you never knew about, opportunities I turned down because I couldn't travel for weeks at a time, positions I accepted later than others because I needed flexible hours to be a mother. Andrew stared at me, as if trying to piece together fragments he'd never had before. And then, I said, one day things began to change. My work was recognized. I was given bigger projects. I learned how to lead, not with authority, but with endurance. I rested my hand on my glass of water, but didn't drink. At this point, I said very slowly, I am one of the senior executives of that corporation. The words dropped onto the table like a heavy object. Andrew opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Claire froze. Elaine looked at me, her eyes for the first time no longer fully controlled. Thomas narrowed his eyes as if recalculating an equation he'd gotten wrong from the start. I'm not saying this to brag, I added as soon as I saw the shift. I'm saying it because perhaps it's time the truth was placed where it belongs. I looked straight at my son. My income is not a small number. Each month, it's enough to buy the house you're living in within just a few years. Andrew went completely still. I could see it clearly. His shoulders sagged, his eyes empty for several long seconds. I knew that in his mind, an entire past was being rewritten. That's impossible, Thomas blurted out, then fell silent. Elaine took a very deep breath. Claire raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide. I've earned that much for many years, I said, without emphasis, without avoidance. And I chose to live the way you've seen, not because I couldn't live differently, but because I didn't need to. The balance of the dinner shifted completely. The earlier concern now felt out of place. The offer of a monthly allowance sounded clumsy, almost ridiculous. Andrew looked at me, his voice rough. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my son for a long moment. "Because I wanted you to become the man you are today, not someone who lives off anyone else, me included." Claire turned to look at her parents. I didn't need to read her thoughts to understand. The world had tilted. Elaine said nothing for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer as soft as before. "You hid this." "I didn't hide it," I replied gently. "I just didn't put it on display." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence gone. "We didn't know." "I know," I said. "And that's why I listened to your offer all the way through." Andrew lowered his head. Claire took a deep breath. No one mentioned money the way they had earlier anymore. The dinner had turned. Not because I raised my voice, not because I was angry, but because my life story, told at the right moment, had exposed another truth. Their initial judgments had been wrong at the root, and I knew that from this moment on, no one at the table would ever be able to look at me the same way again. I didn't speak immediately after finishing my story. Not because I needed to regain my composure, but because I wanted to give them enough time to understand that this dinner no longer belonged to them. Elaine was the first to move. She adjusted her posture, folding her hands together on the table, as if trying to reclaim a sense of control that had just slipped away. Thomas looked at me with an expression completely different from before. No longer the confidence of a man used to deciding, but the caution of someone who had realized he misjudged his opponent. Andrew said nothing. My son looked at me as if seeing a new person, yet wearing the face of the woman who had raised him for decades. In his eyes, I saw confusion mixed with guilt. And Claire. She lowered her head, not out of politeness, but out of shame. I reached into my old fabric bag. That movement made Elaine track every inch of it, her eyes fixed on my hand, as if she feared I might pull out something else that would further overturn the order she knew. I opened the hidden compartment inside the bag, slowly, without haste. Then I placed the black card on the table. I didn't slam it down. I didn't show it off. I simply set it there, directly in front of Elaine. The card lay there, simple, dark, unadorned. But in the world of people like her, it didn't need to say much. It said everything. The air seemed to freeze. Elaine stared at the card for a long time. I saw the exact moment she realized every assumption she'd made had completely collapsed. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat moving slightly. Andrew sucked in a sharp breath. Claire covered her face, then lowered her hand as if unsure what to do with her emotions. "I'd like to be very clear about one thing," I said, calmly but firmly. "I don't need any allowance." Elaine looked up. "Margaret, that's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," I cut in, not raising my voice, "and that's exactly why I'm refusing." I looked straight at her. Not because the amount is small, but because what you offered isn't help, it's a transaction. Thomas frowned. "That wasn't our intention." "Yes, it was," I said evenly. "You just didn't call it by its real name." I gently turned the black card with my fingertip, not to show off, but to make it clear I understood this game very well. You use money to buy peace of mind, to buy distance, to manage things that make you uncomfortable. Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that evening, she couldn't find the right words. "I don't blame you for being wealthy," I continued, "and I don't blame you for being used to solving problems with money, but I do blame you for seeing me as a problem that needed to be handled." I turned to Thomas. "You talked about old age, about financial burdens, but you never once asked what I needed. You just assumed." Then I turned back to Elaine. Your concern, your compliments that sounded kind, they all served one purpose: to place me lower so you could feel like you were the ones giving. Elaine's face reddened, not with anger, but with exposure. I played the role you thought I was, I said slowly. A simple woman, someone not used to places like this, someone who should be grateful just to be invited to the table. Andrew lowered his head. I saw his shoulders tremble slightly. And you treated me exactly the way you treat people you believe are beneath you, I said. Not rudely, not directly, but enough to make them understand their place. Claire looked up, her eyes red. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice shaking. I shouldn't have stayed silent. I looked at Claire. In her eyes was real shame, not about money, but about behavior. I nodded slightly. That's enough for me to hear. Elaine and Thomas remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because anything they said now would be too late. I signaled the waiter. He stepped over, his eyes flicking briefly to the black card on the table, then immediately becoming far more serious. I'll take the check, I said. Thomas startled. That's not necessary. We invited... I know, I smiled, but tonight I'm treating. The waiter nodded, took the card, and walked away. No one spoke while we waited. The silence now wasn't heavy with tension, but with everyone having to recalibrate their understanding. When the waiter returned, he placed the bill in front of me. The number was clear, undisguised. I didn't look closely. I signed, slipped the card back into my old fabric bag, the same bag that hours earlier had been judged unfit for this place. Andrew looked at the number, then at me. I could see the moment he understood. The monthly allowance they'd offered earlier was, in reality, a very small figure. I stood up, not hurried, not angry. I stood the way I had stood in many important moments of my life, with my back straight and my head held high. I hope, I said, looking at Elaine and Thomas, that if you continue to use money to define people, you'll at least be more careful. I turned to Andrew. My son stood as well, his eyes wet. Mom, he said, but I placed my hand over his, signaling that I understood. We'll talk tonight, I told him, but not here. Finally, I looked at Claire. You still have plenty of time to become the person you want to be. Don't let your silence hurt others. Claire nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. The warm lights behind me no longer made me feel small. I walked in my old dress, worn shoes, faded fabric bag, but every step was steady. I left with everything I had brought to the dinner. Not money, not status, but dignity, intact. I arrived back at my apartment when the city lights were fully on. The familiar hallway was quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps. Dawn was still at the desk, looking up to greet me with the same kind smile as every evening. Have a good night, Miss Lawson. Have a peaceful night, I replied, my voice lighter than I expected. When the apartment door closed behind me, I stood still for a long moment, not because I was tired, but because I needed a few minutes to fully feel what had just happened. There was no victory and no bitterness, just a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. I changed out of my dress, poured myself a cup of hot tea, and sat in my familiar chair by the window. The city outside continued to move, countless other stories unfolding in parallel, unaware that at a luxurious restaurant not far away, an order once thought unshakable had been quietly disturbed. My phone vibrated. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a few seconds before answering. Mom! My son's voice came through, hoarse and rushed, as if he'd been running for a long time. "Did you make it home?" "I did," I replied. "Are you okay?" On the other end, Andrew was silent for a few beats. I heard him exhale heavily. I don't know what to say. "Then don't say anything," I said gently. "Listening is fine." "Mom," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm sorry." Those two words came late, but they weren't meaningless. "Sorry for what?" I asked, not to pressure him, but to let him face it himself. "For letting it happen," Andrew said quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his courage if he slowed down. "For introducing you like you were something that needed explaining. For staying silent when they said things they shouldn't have." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Andrew," I said, "I'm not angry with you, but I'm angry with myself," he replied. "I didn't see it. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You're living in a world where things like that are considered normal," I said. "I understand. But I don't want to keep living like that," Andrew said, his voice firmer now. Tonight made me rethink a lot. I didn't answer right away. I let my son continue, let him give shape to the thoughts tumbling in his head. "I realized," Andrew said more slowly, "that a lot of what I've had over the past few years didn't come entirely from me. The contracts, the opportunities, the doors that opened too easily." I opened my eyes and looked out the window. "And how does that make you feel?" "It feels like I'm standing on ground I didn't build myself," he replied. "And tonight, I don't want to stand there anymore." I heard something new in my son's voice, a new clarity, not impulsive, not blind rebellion, but a resolve that was taking shape. "Have you talked to Claire yet?" I asked. Andrew sighed. "She left our place a little while ago. She cried a lot." Not long after that, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was Claire. I answered right away. "Aunt Margaret," Claire said, her voice trembling but clear. I'm sorry." "You've already said that," I replied, "and I heard you." "But I need to say more," Claire said. "I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. I let my parents shape everything, and I didn't dare stand up." "You were afraid," I said, not as a question. "Yes," Claire admitted. "I was afraid of losing their support, afraid of disappointing them. But tonight, when you stood up and said those things, I realized I was more disappointed in myself." I listened. I didn't rush to comfort her, because sometimes what someone needs most isn't reassurance, but the space to face their own emotions. "Andrew told me," Claire continued, "that he wants to walk his own path, not rely on my father anymore." I stayed silent, letting her go on. "I know that will start a big fight," Claire said, her voice lowering. "My father, he was very angry." I could picture it clearly. Thomas Bennett wasn't a man accustomed to losing control. To him, Andrew's independence wasn't a personal choice. It was a rejection of influence, and that was the hardest thing for him to accept. "And Elaine?" I asked. Claire hesitated. "My mother. She hasn't said much, but I can see she's worried. Not worried about me, worried about losing her grip on things." I nodded, though Claire couldn't see it. Elaine Bennett was used to arranging other people's lives with gentle words and well-timed support. When that tool stopped working, fear followed. "I don't know where this is going," Claire said, "but I don't want to go back to how things were." "No one knows," I replied, "but you've started by looking the truth in the eye. That matters." After I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The aftershocks of that dinner were spreading outward, like ripples on water. Andrew began re-examining his career path, Not with pure pride anymore, but with honesty. He told me later that he had turned down a new project Thomas had introduced him to. No argument, just a clear refusal. Thomas reacted harshly. Andrew recounted it, his voice tired but steady. He said I was ungrateful, that I was destroying my own future. "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think," Andrew replied, "that if that future requires me to bow to things I don't believe in, then maybe it's not the future I want." Elaine, according to Claire, began calling more often. No concrete offers anymore, just roundabout questions, reminders about family, about stability. But behind them was a clear fear, losing control over her daughter and son-in-law. I didn't intervene, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I stepped in too early, every change would be blamed on me. Andrew and Claire needed to stand on their own decisions, to face the conflicts forming around them themselves. I watched from a distance. I listened when Andrew called, when he was confused, when he doubted himself. I listened when Claire talked about the growing tension in her family. I didn't give instructions. I only asked questions, just enough for them to find their own answers. The Bennett family began to crack, not because I spoke the truth, but because that truth exposed fractures that had always been there, merely hidden beneath money and power. And I knew this was only the beginning of a long process. But sometimes all it takes is one dinner and one person willing to stand up with dignity for things to never return to the way they were. 3 days after that dinner, as I was organizing some old files on my desk at home, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I was about to ignore it, but instinct made me answer. "Margaret?" Elaine Bennett's voice came through, lower than I'd ever heard it. May I see you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window where the late afternoon sunlight was sliding slowly across familiar rooftops. I knew this call would come sooner or later. I just didn't know how. "Where?" I asked. Elaine paused briefly. "At the Fairmont, the afternoon tea lounge downstairs, if that feels appropriate." I understood the choice. A refined setting, her familiar territory, a place where Elaine wouldn't feel completely off balance. "All right," I said, 11 a.m. When I arrived at the Fairmont, the grand lobby still held its familiar elegance. Polished marble floors, high-hanging chandeliers, a faint trace of perfume in the air. I wore something simple but neat, not the old dress and not clothing that made others wary. Just me, plainly. Elaine was already there. She had chosen a table in the corner where she could see the room but still have privacy. When she saw me, she stood up, not rushed, not stiff, just proper. This time, without judgment. "Thank you for coming," Elaine said. "I wanted to hear what you had to say," I replied. We sat down. Tea was brought over. Elaine ordered her usual black tea. I ordered herbal tea. A small detail, but I noticed Elaine's eyes pause there briefly, as if she were wondering how many things she'd missed by always seeing people through fixed frames. "That dinner," Elaine began, then stopped. She took a deep breath. "I was very shocked." "I know," I said. "Not only by the truth about you," Elaine continued, her voice slower now, "but by the way I realized I had behaved. I was ashamed." The word didn't come easily. I could see it in the way she gripped her teacup. "All my life," Elaine said, "I was taught that status is everything. My father always said, if you're not standing above others, they'll step on you. There's no middle ground." She looked off into the distance, as if seeing some old, closed-off room in her memory. I grew up at dinners where adults didn't talk about people, only about their value, where they lived, who knew whom, Who owed whom? I didn't interrupt. From a young age, I learned to observe, Elaine said, not to understand, but to classify, and I carried that habit into adulthood without realizing it. She looked back at me. When I met you, I did what I knew best. I nodded. You judged. Yes, Elaine admitted, and I was wrong. The air between us was tense, but not hostile, like two people standing before a large mirror, forced to look at the parts they usually avoid. There's something that unsettles me even more, Elaine went on, her voice dropping, when I realized I was jealous of you. I was slightly surprised, but I didn't show it. Not because of money, Elaine said quickly, as if afraid I'd misunderstand, but because of freedom. You don't need anyone's approval. You don't need to show off. You walked into that room, and even though I thought I was above you, in reality, you were the only one who wasn't bound. She gave a thin smile. I've been bound my whole life without realizing it. I set my teacup down. Money, I said, is just a tool. It can build bridges. It can also build walls. The issue isn't the amount, but the purpose people use it for. Elaine listened without interrupting. I've never used money to control others, I continued, not because I'm noble, but because I know how heavy it feels to be controlled. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her gaze had changed, not as sharp as before, but something more weary. I thought I was protecting my daughter, she said, but maybe I was just protecting my own position. That's not an easy realization, I replied. Elaine fell silent. After a moment, she spoke very slowly. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. It carried hesitation, the tension between real regret and the habit of saving face, but I didn't dismiss it. I hear you, I said, but I'm not ready to say everything is fine. Elaine nodded without the defensiveness she'd shown before. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away. Forgiveness, I said, isn't something that can be demanded. It comes after change. Elaine looked up. And do you believe I can change? I looked at her for a long time. The woman in front of me was still Elaine Bennett, elegant, wealthy, used to control. But somewhere in her eyes was a small crack, and sometimes that's where light gets in. I believe, I said slowly, that anyone can change, but not everyone is willing to pay the cost. Elaine took a deep breath. I don't want to lose my daughter. I know, I said, and that may be motivation enough. We sat a while longer. We didn't talk about Andrew. We didn't talk about Claire. We talked about very human things, about the fear of aging, about letting go, about realizing you've lived too long by other people's expectations. When we stood to leave, Elaine looked at me. Thank you for meeting me. I didn't meet you to help you, I said. I met you to tell the truth. She nodded. Maybe that's the greatest help. We parted in the hotel lobby. I stepped outside and took in a breath of cool air. I didn't know how much Elaine would change. I wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but I knew one thing. I hadn't closed the door. Not with hurried forgiveness, but by leaving enough space for change, if it came, to enter. Change didn't arrive all at once, and it wasn't loud. It came slowly, bit by bit, like an old room gradually brightening as someone opens windows that have been shut for too long. Andrew changed the most. A week after my meeting with Elaine, my son called me, his voice far calmer than it had been in those early days of confusion. Mom, he said, I turned down the financial support package from Claire's family. I wasn't surprised, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. They said it was only temporary, Andrew told me, that I didn't need to do this, that everyone benefited. But I realized if I accepted it, then none of my future decisions would really be mine anymore. "And how do you feel?" I asked. "Light," he replied without hesitation. "Lighter than I expected." The decision hadn't been easy. Andrew told me about the tense conversation with Thomas. He hadn't yelled or slammed the table, but every word carried carefully wrapped disappointment. He said I was throwing away a prepared future. Andrew said that there are people who spend their whole lives never getting a chance to stand where I stood. "And what did you say?" I asked. "I told him," Andrew replied slowly, "that if that future requires me to keep bowing my head to preserve it, then maybe it isn't a future I want to live." Thomas wasn't used to answers like that. From that moment on, his influence began to fade, not because Andrew rebelled, but because Andrew no longer needed his approval. And for people like Thomas, nothing renders them more powerless than losing their central role in someone else's decisions. Andrew started over in a new job, not glamorous, not a salary that made people marvel, a lower position than what he'd once been promised, but one he earned with his own ability. On his first day, Andrew sent me a very short message. "I'm tired today, but I feel like I'm standing upright." I smiled when I read it. Claire changed, too, in a quieter way. She didn't make grand declarations. She didn't cut ties completely with her family, but small habits began to shift. Claire told me, during a long afternoon conversation, that she had sold the expensive car her parents had given her and replaced it with a simpler one. Not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to feel more clearly the value of the things she earned herself. "I realized," Claire said, "that until now I've never really had to think carefully about how I spend money, and that has made me disconnected from real life." She started cooking more. Meals were no longer about ordering from upscale restaurants, but simple dinners, sometimes just soup and bread. Andrew told me that during those meals they talked more, not about big plans, not about opportunities or connections, but about very ordinary things. Elaine, just as I had expected, changed the slowest. She didn't give up her controlling habits overnight, but she began to learn how to pause. Instead of giving advice that wasn't asked for, she asked questions. Instead of arranging things, she listened. Sometimes she simply listened in silence, something she had rarely done before. Claire told me that once Elaine called just to ask, "Are you okay?" and then waited quietly for the answer without adding any reminders afterward. For someone like Elaine, that was a significant step. Thomas was different. He wasn't used to losing influence, not used to having words that once carried weight reduced to mere opinions. He appeared less often in family conversations. When he did show up, he was usually quiet or spoke in short sentences, no longer with the enthusiasm he once had. There were family meals Andrew described where Thomas barely mentioned work, real estate, or powerful acquaintances. Not because he had completely changed, but because no one wanted to listen to those stories anymore. Those meals, according to Claire, felt strange but easy to breathe in. No more showing off. No more half-joking comments about money. Just people sitting at the same table, eating the same food, speaking to one another in their real voices. I didn't appear often at those gatherings, not because I was excluded, but because I chose to keep my distance. I didn't want my presence to become a shadow that made them change because of me, instead of because of themselves. I watched from afar, through phone calls, messages, and stories told back to me. I saw Andrew learn to say no without apologizing. I saw Claire learn to ask questions instead of automatically accepting things. I saw Elaine sometimes confused, but not returning to her old ways. And I saw Thomas, gradually being forced to face the truth that power doesn't last forever if it isn't built on respect. The family began to speak honestly with one another, not always gently. There were tense conversations, tears, long silences, but they were real conversations, no longer covered up by gifts or financial support. Respect in that way was rebuilt, not based on who had more money, but on who dared to live according to their own values. And me, I didn't take revenge. I didn't use my truth to overpower anyone. I didn't use money to reverse roles. I didn't step into that family as a winner. I stepped back, letting go of power I fully could have used, because I learned very early on that real power doesn't lie in controlling others, but in not needing to do so. Letting go isn't weakness. Letting go is trusting that others can grow on their own if they are given the space. And in that slow change, I realized something. The values that once stood highest had been turned upside down, not through punishment, but through truth, patience, and each person choosing again the path they wanted to walk. The news that Andrew was about to become a father reached me on a very quiet afternoon. My son called, his voice unable to hide its tremble, even as he tried to sound calm. He spoke slowly, as if afraid that if he spoke too fast, the moment would slip away. "Mom, Claire is pregnant." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because a very deep, very warm feeling was spreading through my chest. A circle in my life after so many years seemed about to close in the gentlest way. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I am," Andrew replied. "This time, I really am." I smiled, a smile that didn't need forcing. I knew exactly what those words, "really okay," meant. They weren't just about becoming a father, but about having found solid ground for himself, without dependence, without borrowing, without needing anyone's backing. Since that dinner years ago, there have been no more secrets between Andrew and me. We talk to each other like two adults, not with one-sided protection and not with silent gaps. Andrew asks me about my work, about decisions I made in the past. I ask him about his current worries, about the fear of becoming a father, about the pressure of carrying responsibility on his own shoulders. Some evenings we simply sit on the balcony of my small apartment, drinking tea, watching the city lights come on. No one has to prove anything. No one has to play a role. Once, as I was reorganizing my closet, Andrew happened to notice the old gray dress hanging in the far corner. "You still keep it?" he asked. I nodded. That dress is still there. Faded. Ordinary. No longer worn. But I didn't throw it away, not because of attachment, but because it is a marker. A very personal reminder that one evening I walked into a room looking like the person everyone underestimated the most, and walked out with my dignity completely intact. I don't keep that dress because of pain. I keep it because of clarity. The years that followed passed more gently than I ever expected. Elaine didn't become a different person overnight, but she learned how to step back. No more arranging, no more deciding for others. There were moments when she still fumbled, still wanted to intervene, but then she stopped. Something she had never done before. Thomas remained Thomas, but his power was no longer the center of every conversation. He learned to be silent more often, even if not always willingly, and sometimes silence itself is a lesson. Claire changed the most in ways that surprised me. She didn't try to prove she was simple or different. She just lived more honestly, asked more honestly, and dared to say no to things that had once been considered obvious. I stood at the edge of all those changes, not leading, not controlling, not needing recognition. I simply observed with the calm of someone who understands that if something is true, it will stand on its own without anyone holding it up. Some mornings, I wake up very early, make coffee, and sit alone in my small kitchen. I think about the journey I've taken, from a poor young woman to an exhausted single mother, to a woman studying at night under dim light, to a woman sitting in a luxury restaurant without needing to prove who she is. I came to understand one thing. Sometimes the truth needs to be tested, not to hurt others, but to see who truly deserves to stand beside you when all the layers fall away. Wealth, in the end, has never been about the numbers in a bank account. Wealth lies in freedom, the freedom not to bow your head in exchange for acceptance. Wealth lies in dignity, something no one can buy and no one can take away unless you allow it. Now I live true to myself. I don't need to walk into any room to prove my worth. I don't need my title spoken before my words are heard. I don't need money to create distance, and I don't need simplicity to hide strength. I only need to be myself, a mother, a woman about to become a grandmother, someone who has gone far enough to understand that the greatest wealth in life isn't what you own, but what you don't lose along the way. And if you've stayed with me until these final lines, perhaps somewhere in my story, you've seen a part of yourself, in the silence, in the hard choices, in the desire to be respected for who you truly are. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching this story from. Have you ever been in a moment where your value was misjudged? I would truly love to read your story. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the stories to come. Thank you, truly, for giving your time, your attention, and your heart to this story.